Hello, my name is Tejvan Pettinger from Economics Help, and today we're going to look at the importance of international trade. So international trade is when one country exports a good or service such as a motor car to another and then imports other goods it can't produce like food or raw materials. And international trade is very important for quite a few reasons. Just to kind of summarize, it enables greater choice for consumers. It enables us to make greater use of surplus raw materials and enables much greater economies of scale because firms and countries can specialize in producing certain goods that are then transported around the world. So international trade has been around for many hundreds of years. You go back even 1,000 years and there was still some international trade, importing of spices from abroad, exporting goods and raw materials from Europe. But in the 20th century, international trade has become much more important. It's become a very significant part of the global economy. Around 30% of global GDP is now traded internationally, and so it affects people around the world. So the first obvious benefit of international trade is that it enables a much greater choice of goods and services, and you can make use of surplus raw materials. So if you take oil-producing countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, all that oil is not much use unless they can export it to other countries, because it's far more oil than they need. But by exporting oil, they gain revenue that they can then import goods from other countries. On the other side of the coin, if you look at Japan, has quite limited natural resources, has no oil, so it needs to import oil. But Japan has specialized in producing many manufactured goods and high-tech electronic goods, so it can export these to countries like Saudi Arabia or European countries, and it gets a revenue in order to be able to buy the raw materials. But without this trade, the Japanese economy would be very limited, as would many other countries. So one of the theories behind international trade is comparative advantage. What this states is that countries who specialize in producing goods with a lower opportunity cost will benefit from increased economic welfare. So, for example, China has specialized in producing labor-intensive goods, manufactured clothes, because China has quite low labor costs. Whereas the United States has specialized in producing, say, biotech, design of computers, goods and services where less labor-intensive but more higher tech. And by specializing in producing those different goods, China and America can trade. And so it saves the US having a relatively more inefficient clothing industry, and it saves China having to design, say, the Apple iPhone or something like that. Another importance of international trade is simply the economies of scale that are really very significant in many modern industries. If you take an industry like, say, the motor industry, the economies of scale are really very large. At least 500,000 cars need to be produced before you start to exhaust economies of scale, because the fixed costs of producing it are very high. Now, the importance of this is that there's no point in each individual country having its own car industry, because for small countries it would be very expensive, it would be uneconomical. But through specialization, the motor industry is very much a global one. And if you take the manufacture of any particular car, it's rarely all done in one country. The process is split throughout the world. So there's a global supply network. Maybe the rubber, the tires is imported from Indonesia. The engine is made in Germany. These raw materials are brought together and assembled in, say, Nissan factory in Sunderland. So economies of scale really mean that firms and industries need to specialize. And New trade theory states that economies of scale are so high, but it doesn't matter so much what a country specialises in, but the important thing is to specialise in something, because economies of scale will build up and this will enable the firm to become much more efficient. Another importance of international trade is that it simply gives greater choice. And we kind of forget when we go to a supermarket how much might be imported. We get fruit and veg from around the world. It enables us to have a wide choice of food throughout the year and not be dependent upon seasons like we used to be. International trade has also been very important for improving living standards and reducing poverty, especially if we look at, say, Southeast Asia. In the past 50 years or so, they have based their economies a lot on exports, and export revenue has enabled economic growth, higher wages, increased living standards. And whilst international trade may have drawbacks we'll come to in a moment, it shouldn't be forgotten that international trade does create a lot of jobs and income for developing economies, and it can be an important engine of economic growth. Now, as well as international trade being very important, it's worth bearing in mind that it does have potential drawbacks. So, for example, the environmental cost of trade. Because trade is so important, it's a net contributor to CO2 emissions and global warming, and this is causing some people to question whether we need to be importing our food from all around the world, and maybe we should do better to buy more local goods rather than trading all the time. Also, international trade can get caught up in the controversies of whether free trade is in everyone's interests, because whilst free trade has many benefits, it has been argued that developing countries may struggle with free trade because they're unable to compete with more established industries in the West, and without some tariff protection they will struggle to develop and diversify their economy. Nevertheless, although this is a factor, it shouldn't be neglected that international trade is very important, not just for the developed world, but also the developing world.